the holidays.
Amazing. Well, Ari, thank you so much for that introduction. It's such a pleasure to get to be learning with you again virtually, to be back in your community. As Ari said, I'm Avi Strausberg. I work for Hadar that offers all sorts of Jewish adult education learning opportunities. And our course today is one of my favorite ones, Revisiting the Jewish Bookshelf. It's a course that's really near and dear to my heart for two reasons. I'll say one, I think one of the greatest gifts of being Jewish are our Jewish bookshelves. Like, you really, in a lot of ways, I think you know a Jewish home by the books and by the bookshelves. And it's a little bit of there's the language of a blessing and a curse, in the sense that I think the incredible blessing of being Jewish and the incredible blessing of being a people that is so rooted in our books is that there is always more to learn. And that's an amazing gift to feel. I have no sense of, I have a 5-year-old who's been spending a lot of time looking at our bookshelves since we never leave the house. And he's been asking me a lot of, how long is it going to take? Have you learned all the books on your bookshelf? How long is it going to take for you to learn all of the books on your bookshelf? And I say with absolute confidence, I don't think I'm never going to learn all of the pages of all of the books on our bookshelf. And what a bizarre concept to have a bookshelf full of books and to say with confidence that I will never learn all of those books, that it's an impossibility. And so I think the gift there is that there's so much potential, is that every year, the idea of revisiting, there is always something to revisit because there's always more learning. And that each year we could set for ourselves different learning goals of, this year we're going to focus on this book, or this year we're going to get to know, or we could just keep focusing on the same book, the Torah, every year, but there's always more to learn. I think that the difficulty there is that it can be so overwhelming, is that the amount of books that one might want to get to know. There's Torah. I'm just going to throw out terms. So if you feel overwhelmed, it's okay, because that's what we're doing here, is learning what these terms are. There's Chumash and Tanakh and all the law books and the Mishnah and the Gemara and the Midrash and all these words about that same Hebrew sound. And who knows what any of them mean, that it could actually be, it's either a gift how much there is to learn, or it could be totally overwhelming, such that you just sort of say, it's too much, I don't understand. And so that's what we're hoping, that's what we're going to do today. And that's what we're going to do in our 5 sessions together, and then ultimately our 10 sessions, is in each of our sessions, we're going to tackle a different book of the Jewish bookshelf. And we're going to do this in 2 ways. One is by talking about it and learning about what is this book, what is its function, how does it function in terms of the rest of the Jewish canon, what would you go to it for? But really the main way what we're going to do, we're going to get to know the book, is by actually learning some key text within the book. We're not just going to talk about the book, we're going to learn the book. We're going to learn some selections from the Shulchan Aruch, a Jewish legal code from the 16th century. We're going to learn some key Hasidic texts from the 19th century. We're going to learn these texts, and it's by learning these texts themselves that we'll get to know these texts. And my hope is that by the end of this course, you'll have a better sense of what are the different books on your Jewish bookshelf, what books might you want to revisit, and what books might you want to add. I'll say this is the first time I sort of taught this course was several years ago now, and I've been adding and changing this course because actually my own Jewish bookshelf has changed a lot since I first created this course 3 or 4 years ago, that I've added books, I've added learning. And so there's a sense in which our Jewish bookshelf should always be changing, because we should be always adding to our learning and adding to the things we want to know. The last story that I just want to share with you by means of why this course is so near and dear to my heart is that I actually came to Jewish learning pretty late, grew up Jewish, went to Hebrew school, sort of a classic Hebrew school education, and just I never really did any formal study of Mishnah or Talmud or whatever those words are. I didn't do that until later in life. And when I was first getting into Jewish learning in my mid-20s, I was on a Jewish farm in Connecticut, and I decided I wanted to take the step of owning a Chumash. What's a Chumash? Chumash coming from the word chamesh, or 5. Chumash is the 5 books. So it's specifically, Mimi's holding it up for me. Thank you, Mimi. It's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So Chumash is specifically the Torah, but the Torah in the narrow sense of just the 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So I decided while I was on this Jewish farm in Connecticut that had its own bookstore that I wanted to own my own Chumash. I went to the bookstore, I touched all the books, I looked at all the books, I found one that had a nice blue cover that I felt really good at, good about. I bought it and I showed it to my teacher mentor afterwards with such excitement. And I said, look, I'm investing in my Jewish education. I bought myself a Chumash. And he said, that's a Tanakh. What's a Tanakh? Totally different book. Okay. And this is very much, this is a good story to start us off today, because what we're focusing on today is really Torah. What is a Tanakh? Tanakh is an acronym. So if you imagine me writing it out on the board in front of you, the Tanakh with the Taf standing for Torah, the Nun standing for Nivi'im or prophets, and the Chaf at the end standing for Ketuvim or writings. A Tanakh is all the books of the Torah, so the 5 books that we just said in the Chumash, all the books of the prophets, so Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Joshua, all those guys, and all the books of Ketuvim, of writing, so that's books like Esther, Job, Psalms, Song of Songs, all of those. And so a Tanakh, it's like if the Chumash is this big, the Tanakh is like this big. Anyway, so I'm very happy to own my Tanakh, but it was already my first lesson, and I thought I was buying the Chumash. I was so excited, but I actually had bought this totally other book. And so the hope and the goal for this is for those of you that are revisiting books that you already know and love, this is a chance to go deeper. And for those of you that are sort of learning about some of these for the first time, this is a chance to get to not only know the terms and hopefully come away with an understanding of what is a Chumash versus Tanakh, what is the Mishnah versus Gemara, is that different than the Talmud, how does that relate to the Shulchan Aruch? Not only to get to know the words, but also to get to know a little bit about the nature of the books themselves. Okay, that was by means of intro, and I'll just say specifically for these 5 sessions, the first session, 2 sessions, we're going to be focusing on Torah. So this session is going to be focused on Torah and some of the major commentators on Torah, the major mifarshim, the people who, it comes from the word lifarish, to explicate or to interpret. So the Torah and the commentators. And next session is going to be focusing on midrashim, and so we'll get into what a midrash is next week, but we'll be looking at interpretations of the Torah. And then sessions 3, 4, and 5 are all going to be focusing on Jewish legal text, tracking one idea, one concept chronologically through its legal trajectory. So starting with the Mishnah, going to the Gemara, and going to later legal books. But again, all of that, if all that is mumble jumble, that's okay, because the whole point is we're going to get there when we get there. Okay, let's dive into today's session. So today's session, we're going to be starting with a story that I think is familiar to many of us. We're going to be looking at the story of Noah's Ark and the story of the flood. But my hope is that we're going to see it with new eyes. I really want to dig deep into it. And as we turn and read the story, because our main goal today is really to read the story and look at a few commentaries on it, my main goal is to notice. I want you to notice what's interesting, what's different, what's surprising, and I want you to ask questions. I want you to ask, I'm not answering your questions. Don't think I'm going to answer your questions, but I want you to ask as many questions as you can about the text. So often when we're reading Torah, or really any text, it's easy just to read it and sort of to move on and say, I got it, especially with a story like Noah's Ark, where probably the story may be familiar to you, to say, I know Noah's Ark. We don't need to learn Noah's Ark. I want you to do the opposite today. Okay, I want you to get into the mind of a commentator, and the purpose of a commentator is to notice what is missing, what is different, what is surprising, what is confusing, and to ask questions on it. So we want to get in the minds of the commentators, because in order to really understand the commentaries, we need to first understand, well, why are they commentating? What's interesting or surprising? Okay, so that's going to be the goal. Why Noah's Ark? Why are we going to be looking at the story of Noah's Ark? Besides that, I think it's a great story to revisit something that's familiar, to really stop and ask questions. I'll just say, for me, it has the added lens of, I feel like we're in a bit of our own Noah's Ark right now, where the world around us is flooding. We are all holed up in our own individual arks. And there's a sense of, we came into the ark thinking it was going to be 40 days. And now 6 months later, many of us are still in the ark. And there's the question of, how long are we going to be in the ark? And when are we going to come out of our arks? And how will we know it's safe to come out of our arks? And what is it going to feel like to come out of the ark? And what is the world going to look like when we come out of the ark? What is the world, and what is that process of rebuilding the world going to be when we finally get there? So we're reading the story of Noah's Ark today really for 2 levels. One is just to understand how to read Torah, how to notice, how to ask questions, what is the role of the commentators. And the second lens is, I just want you to have in the back of your mind is what are the resonances of the story of Noah's Ark to the moment that we are in today, a moment in which we are all in our arks. Okay, and my last and final piece of introduction is I want you to pay special attention to the birds in the story. This is not probably a detail that you've given much thought, is the role of the dove and the raven. But if you haven't given a lot of focus to the dove and raven, I want to give them all of our love and focus, because they're going to be the subject of the interpretations that we'll be looking at next week. So give special thought to the dove and ravens. Okay, without further ado, we'll make sure that you have the source sheet shared in the chat. I think I even have a link pulled up for you. So you could go ahead if you want. I think you had it in PDF. Ari sent it to you. You have it in the chat if you want it in the chat. And I'm actually going to go ahead and screen share. And I'll just say the way that we're going to read the story now is we're going to read it paragraph by paragraph. I'll do the reading, and I'm going to pause, and I'm going to ask you, what do you notice? What are your questions? I'm not going to answer your questions. I just want to hear all of your questions. So really be putting your question hats on, okay? So we're going to go into screen sharing now. Okay, I'll make this bigger so that you can see it better. Okay, everyone's good and can see my screen okay? Amazing. Okay, so get ready to notice and get ready to ask questions. So the context here is we're in Genesis 8. So this is in the beginning of the story. The context is that God has already told Noah to build the ark. He's already gone into the ark with all the animals and the family. The world has been flooding now for 40 days and 40 nights. And then we get to this chapter. God remembered Noach. Vayizkor Elohim et Noach. Vet kol hachaya, vet kol behema asher ito b'teva. God remembered Noach and all the beasts and all the cattle that were with him in the ark. And God caused the wind to blow across the earth, and the waters subsided. The fountains of the deep and the floodgates of the sky were stopped up, and the rain from the sky was held back. The waters then receded steadily from the earth. At the end of 150 days, the waters diminished, so that in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. The waters went on diminishing until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the 1st of the month, the tops of the mountains became visible. So just take a moment to notice and to see what is interesting, what's surprising, what questions do you have about this paragraph. I'm not going to have you write them in the chat just yet, though you're welcome to if you want. You're welcome to put them in the chat to remember them. I want to read one more paragraph with you, and then I really want to see your questions in the chat. So we'll read one more together. At the end of 40 days, Noach opened the window of the ark that he made and sent out the raven. It went to and fro until the waters had dried up from the earth. Just remember a special note to notice the raven and the dove and how the Torah talks about them. Then he sent out the dove to see whether the waters had decreased from the surface of the ground. But the dove could not find a resting place for its foot and returned to him to the ark, for there was water over all the earth. So putting out his hand, he took it into the ark with him. Okay. So go ahead now. I'll show you the first paragraph again, and I'll show you the second. Just take a moment to write down one or two things either that you notice or a question that you have about this text, and just put it into the chat. And then I want to read your questions together. Okay, great. So we have some great questions coming in. Amazing. Okay, so Norman says, I'll just read out some of your questions. If I don't read your question, it's not because it's not amazing. It's just because I can only read so many questions, but I really appreciate all of your questions coming in. So Norman says, God remembered Noach and the people in the ark. Why didn't God remember the other people in the ark? Right, so the text specifically says, so Norman is doing a close reading, which is so good, Norman. It says, Vayizkor Elohim et Noach. and all the animals. And Norman is saying, well, what about all the other people that were with Noah? How come those people aren't mentioned? And that just your question goes with Peter's question, who says, why did God need to remember Noah? Anytime, this is something that the word vayizkor comes up multiple times in this word. It's always a little bit confusing. What does it mean that God remembered Noah? Did God forget Noah? Was God not with Noah the whole time? Did God not bring the flood and send them into the ark? So how do we understand God remembered Noah? Where was God such that God needs to remember Noah? What does that mean? Deborah says, what are fountains of the deep? Such beautiful language. Seems like they are different from the rains of the sky. So we have these different, the fountains of the deep and the floodgates. Okay, good. Norman says, why did God send out a raven and then a dove? What happened to the raven? Did the raven and dove have different jobs? So amazing, Norman. So you're going to you're doing what I asked you to do. We're going to look at commentaries that specifically go to that. Why specifically a raven? Why specifically a dove? What were their jobs? Mimi's pointing out that the levels of the water are not consistent. Good. Chris says, God caused the wind to blow across the earth. Is that a symbol of the breath of life? That's beautiful. So taking us back to Genesis of sort of God's breath animating the world, that God caused the wind to blow across the earth. Maybe now that we're coming back from the flood. Michael says, what happened to the raven? Very good, Michael. So you're noticing the raven, that the raven goes out, goes to and fro. And then what happens to the raven? Then suddenly we've moved on to the dove. Again, Maria says, is the raven just going round and around the ark? So good, so you're noticing the language of the to and fro. Joanne says, so the water receded for 10 months, and then he waited another 40 days. Amazing, Joanne. So you're doing a close reading of at the end of 40 days. What's the 40 days? First of all, what is the 40 days counting from? Like, what is the marker that then Noah counted 40 days from? And why the 40 days? It's sort of interesting when you do a close reading of the text, you see that actually, not only were they not just in there for 40 days, but there were these months where the waters were diminishing, and then there's another 40 days, and then there's going to be even more time that it's not just like, okay, now it's time to leave the ark, but actually the period of leaving the ark is very stopping and starting. Okay, good. Ellen also asked, what happened to the raven? Who or what does the raven symbolize? So many great questions in here. Ari saying, what's the importance of the 7th month and the 10th month? Again, sort of the marking of the time. Why were the cattle separated from the beast? Again, we have what are the fountains at the deep and the floodgates of the sky? So the sort of different mentions of water. The water diminished, but the earth was still covered. Good, so there's this long period of the water diminishing, but that the land's still covered. And even after that, we're gonna see later, it takes a while for the land to be dry. So good, so you're doing an amazing job. That actually, the work I want you to see is when we stop and interrogate the text and ask questions, there are all these questions that come up that it would be so easy for us just to read the text and to move on. And this is, you're doing the work, that's exactly the work that the commentators are going to do for us in a minute, which is to really slow down and notice what's surprising or confusing and to ask questions. But you can only really understand the commentaries if you first do the work yourself of slowing down. So these are all great questions you've raised. Okay, good. So let's go back into the text and see what else we see. So he sends out, so we said, let's just review. So he sends out the raven, it goes to and fro, and we don't know what happened to the raven. He sends out the dove to see whether the waters had decreased. The dove couldn't find a resting place and eventually comes back, and he took it into the ark with him. So that's where we are. He waited another 7 days. Notice that language. He waited another 7 days and again sent out the dove from the ark. The dove came back to him toward evening, and there in its bill was a plucked off olive leaf. Then Noah knew the waters had decreased on the earth. He waited still another 7 days and sent the dove forth, and it did not return to him anymore. How many times has the dove gone out? I think 3 at this point. You have to keep track of that, right? I always think of the dove going out once, but actually if you notice, the dove goes out multiple times. There's these multiple 7-day periods. In the 601st year, in the first month, on the first of the month, the waters began to dry from the earth. So there's the difference, as someone was pointing out. There's the waters diminishing, but the water still covers. There's the waters no longer covering, and now there's the water actually drying from the surface of the earth. And in the 2nd month, on the 27th day of the month, the earth was dry. They go into the ark for 40 days and 40 nights, and it's actually months and months and months until they're able to come out again. God spoke to Noah saying, "Come out of the ark, together with your wife," notice the order here,
together with your wife, your sons, and your sons' wives. Bring out with every living thing of all flesh that is with you, birds, animals, and everything that creeps on earth. And let them swarm on the earth and be fertile and increase on earth. So Noah came out together, notice the order, with his sons, his wife, and his sons' wives. Every animal, every creeping thing, and every bird, everything that stirs on earth came out of the ark by families. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and taking of every clean animal and of every clean bird, he offered burnt offerings on the altar. The Lord smelled the pleasing odor, and the Lord said to himself, never again will I doom the earth because of man, since the devising of man's mind are evil from his youth. Nor will I ever again destroy every living being as I have done. So long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. Okay, so we're going to take a pause there. Once again, I want you to do the work. I'll go back up so you can see the text. I want you to do the work of just noticing what is interesting, surprising, confusing, and just put any of those noticings and your questions into the chat, just so that we can flag it. If you were a commentator and you were being asked to comment and notice what was interesting or surprising on the Torah portion, what would the questions be that you would be responding to? So just go ahead and add those to the chat. Okay, good. So Ellen's noticing the number 40. What's the significance of the number 40? The wandering in the desert for 40 years, the 40 days of the flood. Michelle's noticing the raven as a predator and the dove that is not. That's amazing, Michelle. Tippy noticed that Noah changed the order, that God says, come out with your wife, your sons, and your son's wife, and then Noah comes out in a different order. So what's the significance of that? So Tippy, that's definitely something that the commentators note. Men came out first. Okay, good. So Vivian's asking, why were there clean and unclean animals? How does the text talk about that? Right, taking of every clean animal and every clean bird. It's interesting because at this point, so normally that's referring to like purity and impurity. It's interesting that that's a system that hasn't really been introduced yet at this point in the Torah. So it's interesting that's really something that comes back up more in the book of Leviticus. So Norman says, yeah, Torah speaks of clean and unclean animals, but clean and unclean animals have not yet been defined. So it's a little bit anachronistic to be talking about here that Noah wouldn't even have understood that system. Right, so Mimi says, Mimi, I noticed this too. How did the animals procreate if Noah sacrificed them? Right, it sort of seems almost contradictory. It makes you wonder if the first thing that Noah does when Noah gets out of the ark is to sacrifice some of the animals. Like, was the whole point of bringing the animals onto the ark just so that he could sacrifice them at the end? I thought the whole point was going to be so that then they could go on and procreate and there would be some of those animals. So interesting that part of their function is to then be sacrificed to God. Okay, Michelle is asking about what about sea animals and fish? Right, that's interesting. What happened to them? Actually, Michelle, there are commentaries that talk about that. In the flood, some of the language in the flood, we didn't see that in this piece, but some of the language talks about like all life being annihilated. It's very harsh language. And so they ask, well, does that include the fish? And there's back and forth of some think that even all of the fish and some think that no, they made it through. So what happened to the sea animals and the fish? Sheila says, where's the rainbow? That comes later on, Sheila. So this you feel like is leading up to it, but we haven't yet gotten there to that portion. Okay, so Leonie is asking the very good question. So how many days altogether was Noah in the ark? It's very hard to keep track. We thought he went in for 40 days and 40 nights, and then it seems like maybe 7 months later. So some of the commentators do that work that you're asking of really trying to figure out exactly how many days and trying to pinpoint it based on all this, because it's actually very confusing. Okay, Rob, why does God need a pleasing odor to act beneficently? It's very interesting that text says Noah makes the sacrifices, and the Torah notes the Lord smelled the pleasing odor, and then promises them, okay, I'm never going to destroy mankind again. But it's sort of like, what's the connection? Does God really need the pleasant smell? Had Noah not had this pleasant smell, would he not have made this promise? I think there's a lot of other questions here around what caused God to change God's mind. If God was so set on destroying the world, what changed for God? Why does God vow never to do it again? What does God learn in this process? Rochelle said, did no one have daughters, or were daughters only worth mentioning or having value except as wives to the men? Right. So it's sort of the add-on mention of, there's a whole book actually that someone wrote, a whole sort of like historical fiction on Noach's wife, the unnamed Noach's wife, that here you only talk about women as being in reference to the wives or the sons' wives, but not the daughters as being their own. So we could write some important feminist midrash there. Okay, so you see your questions go on and on, which is so amazing. Susan and Sheldon, how did Noach know how to build the altar? Okay, good. So I'm going to, good. Okay, so the point is, you asked a lot of questions, which I really appreciate. You're doing the work of the commentators. What you're doing is the work of noticing. And now we're actually going to turn to some of the commentators to see how they respond to it. Let me just take one moment to drink some water. Okay. So I want to specifically focus, there are so many commentaries I could have brought. I really want to specifically narrow in and focus on the raven and the dove, just by means of drawing our attention. When we're talking about commentators on the Torah, generally I'm talking about commentators that are from, I would say, the 11th century to about the 15th century is going to be the latest commentary we're going to see today. Commentaries on the Torah, you could find them most easily in a book that looks like this, that is called, this is specifically the Torah Chaim, but there are different versions of this that are called Mikraot Gedolot. So Mikraot coming from the word Mikra, or like a verse or a Torah, and Gedolot are sort of great or many. So it's like many texts. And what a Mikraot Gedolot is, what this book does, so there's 5 different volumes, one for each book of the Torah. And inside this book, you'll see, if you see this little part up here, this is the verse. It only has 2 verses on the page. Everything else on the page is commentary, is different commentary. So you have like a commentary here, 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 here. And this book, this Mikraot Gedolot, this book brings about 5 or 6 different major commentaries. And the idea is that you read 2 verses and then you stop, and there's actually this many questions and commentaries on those 2 verses, that there's so much to say about it. So this is a Mikraot Gedolot. This is going to be all in Hebrew. There's an amazing resource if you want to get into commentaries and Torah studies. Dr. Michael Sarasik produced a version of the Mikraot Gedolot that are in English. That's called the Commentators Bible. And it follows the same form as a traditional Mikraot Gedolot. You'll see this middle section here is the verses. Again, you'll look at how big my page is and look how little of it is actually a verse. They're just doing like 2 verses at a time. And then here are 2 different English translations. And then everything else surrounding it are commentators. So we have 5 different commentaries just on these 2 verses, okay? So the idea is, with traditional Torah study, you're reading it slowly. You're reading 2 verses at a time. You're stopping, you're noticing, you're asking questions. And then you're seeing, based on all the questions that you ask, which many of the questions you raise are exactly the questions that the commentators raise, then you're saying, well, what do the commentators say about it? Who are those commentators, and can I turn to them? So the first commentator that I want to turn to, that I want to learn a little bit with you about today, is Isaac Abarbanel. So Isaac Abarbanel, he is from the 15th century, from Portugal. And part of what is Isaac Abarbanel, he's known for, I would say, 2 main things. He comments on the Torah and also on the Nach, on the prophets and on the writings. And part of what he was doing is he was trying to make the Torah more accessible to the average person. And he did this in 2 ways. One thing that he did is he had really great introductions to all of the books, that the introductions were there to help people. And the other thing that he did is at the beginning of his commentaries, he first listed all of his questions. This is very unusual. So he would start at, say, whatever the book of Genesis was for the first parsha, Bereshit, and then he would first list out as many as 40 questions. It would just be question after question after question after question, and then only then would he start bringing the commentaries to answer it. What I love so much about Abarbanel, is not necessarily just his commentaries, but his questions. And in this book that I have from Michael Sarasek, he actually has a section right here. He just brings Abarbanel's questions. He doesn't even bring his answers, right? Because sometimes it's almost like it doesn't even matter about the answers. What's so important is to slow you down to notice the questions. So I want to start by just looking at some of the questions that Barbado asked to see, are these the questions that we would have asked, or did you have other questions in mind? Sometimes just hearing the questions gets us thinking. So let's look together at Abarbanel's questions. So Abarbanel, and these are, I just pulled 4 for you, but he has many more. So he says, why did Noach wait 40 days to send out the raven after the ark had come to rest and the tops of the mountains were visible? Do you remember that? Someone else noticed that it said, and then after 40 days, he sent them out. What's with the 40 days? 40 days from what? And why did he wait 40 days? How about when the mountains were visible? Why didn't he send them out immediately? So that's a question that Barbado is going to answer. Why did Noach wait 40 days? Why does verse 7 not tell us why Noach sent out the raven, as verse 8 tells us why he sent out the dove? So take a look back at the text here. In the text, it says, he made and he sent out the raven. It went to and fro until the waters had dried it from the earth. Then he sent out the dove to see whether the waters had decreased from the surface of the ground. With the dove, we get a description of why it happens. That's not so with the raven. So Abarbanel is noticing that. He's saying, why do we talk about the dove and the raven differently? With the dove, we give an answer of a reason why he goes out, but the raven, we don't. Why does verse 9 give us so much more detail about the dove than verse 7 does about the raven? And then one more question. Why does Noach twice wait another 7 days to send out the dove? So he's noticing that language, that there's the repetition of he waits another 7 days, and then he waits another 7 days, and he's saying, what's going on with these other 7 days? Why does he keep waiting? Okay, I want to take a pause there. What do you think about Abarbanel's questions? Are any of these your questions? Do you have beginnings of answers to any of these questions? Are you surprised by his questions? And go ahead and just put it in the chat. Oh, the name of the English commentary author is, I'll type it into the chat right now, is Michael Sarasek. There you go. Okay, so one thing that I'll just say, noticing Abarbanel's questions. Okay, so Rena's noticing he's interested in numbers and relationships. That's good. So something that I think is particularly interesting, he's noticing that time delay. He's noticing that Noach waited the 40 days to send out the raven, that he twice waited another 7 days. I think part of what he's drawing our focus to, which I'm particularly interested in right now, is that it's not the flood ended and then they went out of the ark, but that actually it was this real period of sort of stopping and starting. And then the question there is really why? Why was it? What was Noach concerned about? What was that anxiety about? Why not just go out sooner? It's not so easy just to get off the ark even once you realize that you think that the waters might have stopped flooding, that the waters might have gone down, but that you have to wait longer. Okay, so let's go on and we're going to look at another commentary together. Okay. You're able to see my screen. Are you able to see this third text there? Okay. Okay, good. So the next commentary that I want to, these are some interesting questions that could, okay, good. So you're starting to respond to why Noach waits. So Howard says, maybe he thought the ground would be so muddy that he'd sink in it like quicksand. So as he sees that maybe technically we can go out, but he's afraid of what the ground is going to be like. Susan said there has to be a place to live and grow food. Beverly says, has anyone ever addressed the definition of a day? Could it be inconsistent? Right. That's interesting, of even where the modern day concept of days and hours comes from. Okay, so the next one that we're going to look at is none other than Rashi. So Rashi is one of our most famous commentators. Rashi is writing in the 11th century in France. Rashi is known to do two different things. First, Rashi is known for his commentary on the Torah, on 5 books, and also he's very famous for his commentary on the Talmud. So we'll get into that later, but the Rashi's, it said on the Talmud that Rashi's commentary is on the inside pages of the Talmud, so that God forbid there was ever a fire, that Rashi's text would be preserved on the inside, that it's almost impossible now to study Talmud without studying Rashi. So Rashi is writing on the Torah, he's writing on the Talmud, and Rashi's commentary brings a number of different things that Rashi is both interested in pshat and interested in drash. So what is pshat and what is drash? Normally the way it's translated is pshat is understanding and explicating the verse within its sort of literal meaning of what does this verse mean for what it is, what does that word mean in its context just within the verse. And drash is tending to more expound and give meaning and understanding and maybe even moral understanding beyond the verse itself. So just to give you an example of it, it says in the Torah that when the Israelites went out of Egypt, they stopped at a place where there was bitter water, and they called it mara, coming from the word bitter. And so there's one commentary that says, why do they call it bitter? Because the water was bitter like their hearts. So that's the real drash understanding of it's taking the word bitter, mara, and making it a deeper metaphorical symbolic meaning of bitter like their hearts because they had been enslaved. And then someone responds to that commentary and says, no. It couldn't be that he really meant bitter like their heart. That doesn't make any sense. It's that it was really bitter because afterwards the water became sweet when they threw something in it. So that the pshat and drash is both trying to understand it for its literal meaning. What is the word literally meaning? And drash is what does it mean to us? How do we understand it? So let's go ahead and we'll actually look at Rashi's commentary here. So Rashi says, he's commentating on to and fro, that the raven flew to and fro. He says, that is, it simply kept flying around the ark rather than going to do what Noach had sent it for. It suspected Noach of wanting its mate. So Rashi notes, you always have to, when you're reading a commentary, you have to ask a few questions. You have to ask, what are they commentating on? What's the question? What's bothering them? What is the thing they're noticing? What is enabling them to make their comment, right? How are they tying their comment to the text? And what's the comment? So here, what Rashi is noticing is, what is the raven doing going back to and fro? What does that mean? He's bothered by the language of to and fro. And so that's what he's trying to answer. So he says, what is the raven doing going to and fro? It means that he kept simply flying around the ark, not doing what Noach told him to do, because he was afraid that Noach was trying to do something with its mate, okay? A suspicious raven. And here's another verse that Rashi gives us. He says, and on the phrase, until the waters had dried up, he says, on one hand, this phrase is straightforward. It means that the raven flew around to and fro until the waters dried up. That's the pshat. That's the simple meaning, okay? But a midrash, he goes on, he says, a midrash, an interpretation, takes it as follows. The raven was kept at the ready for another mission that it would have to perform when the waters dried up. We see that phrase, when the waters dried up, appears in another place, during the drought in Elijah's time due to lack of rain. So now it's referencing something that we see in another book in the Tanakh, in the book of Kings, that in the book of Kings, in the time of Elijah, when Elijah was hiding from King Ahab, there's a verse that said, the ravens brought him bread and meat every morning and every evening. And so Rashi is making the connection. He's saying, what is it with this raven that just flies around to and fro that doesn't come back to Noach? You all were saying, what happened to the raven? And Rashi is saying, on one hand, the literal meaning is he flew around until the waters dried up. That's the pshat. That's the literal meaning. The drash meaning is it's the same raven in the book of Kings that is ultimately going to bring food back to Elijah there. It's the same raven that he's connecting it. And then he goes on and he says, another reading, he says, he sent out the dove, that's the language from the Torah. From the fact that he waited another 7 days before sending it out, we derive that he waited 7 days before sending it out the first time. So he's noticing the word, he waited another 7 days. Oh, so he must have waited 7 days prior. Then he notes the different verb forms, that it's in one particular verb form and not the other verb form. And he says he did not send the dove to a specific place, but released it to go where it pleased. That is how he would know whether the water decreased. If it found a resting place, it would not come back to him. So I just want to note, Rashi is doing a couple of things here. He's giving us the pshat. He's giving us the simple meaning. What does to and fro means? That he was circling the ark. He's giving us a drash. He's saying, oh, this raven is actually the same. He's connecting the ravens between this raven and this raven. He's saying it's the same raven, and he's giving this sort of this drash of the same raven was waiting for its calling that would come thousands of years later in the Book of Kings. And he's also noticing grammar. He's saying the fact that it was written in this particular verb form and not this, it must teach us something. Okay, I'm going to take a pause there. What I want to ask you is, see if you can articulate, what are the questions? What is Rashi concerned with? What are the questions that Rashi is responding to? When Rashi was making his commentary, what is the question? What are the questions he's interested in? Because different commentators are going to be interested in different things. So what's interesting to Rashi here? Good. So David's saying, what exact mission is the raven on? What was the raven sent to do? Okay, good. Right. Rashi seems to be interested in motivations and logic. There's a lot of the intention of the birds. Granted, that's because I'm deliberately pulling the commentaries on the birds, but that's true. Right. So Rashi seems to, what happens next? Okay, good. Right. So Rashi's interested in, a part of what I think Rashi is interested in are why does the raven fly to and fro? And another thing I think he's interested in, what is the difference between the raven and the doves? So I want to look at, let's look at one more commentary together. Maybe two more commentaries together. So we're also going to look at Radak. So Radak, he's writing in 12th century. So far we've seen two commentaries just to bring us back. So we saw the Barbado, who's in the 15th century. He gives us all those amazing questions. It's almost as if we don't need his answers because his questions are so good. Rashi is in the 11th century. He's giving us the pshat and the drash, both the simple meaning and the midrashic meaning. We're now going to look at the Radak, David Kimchi, who is writing in 12th century, a little bit later, and we're going to see how he understands the text a little bit differently. So he says, and sent out the raven. He figured, this is his commentary, he figured that if the waters had gone down sufficiently, the raven, a carnivore, someone else already noted that, a carnivore would find human animal corpses strewn about the earth and bring back a chunk of flesh in its beak, but it brought back nothing. Okay, so just note for yourself, what is Radak saying here? Why is he answering? What question is he answering? Okay, that's what I want you to think. What question is he answering? Then he sent the dove, commenting on the line, then he sent the dove. When he saw that he had gotten no information from the raven, he sent out a dove, which would at least have the imagination to bring back a response of some kind after being sent out once or twice. And doves, of course, have a natural homing instinct. So Noach was confident it would bring something back to him. Okay, so just go ahead and write in the chat. What is the Radak? What question is the Radak answering? What is he interested in? Good. So Ari is saying Radak is interested in the order of why send a raven and then a dove. Okay, good. Right, because he's explaining specifically why a raven, because a raven is a carnivore, and he's going to see the corpses, and he would have a sense of what life is out. But the fact that he doesn't come back with something in his mouth, then he doesn't have an indicator. Okay, good. Yeah, Howard said Noach's thinking. Then he's explaining, it's not just random. I think normally when I read the story, I'm like, oh, a raven and a dove, and then I move on. And he's saying, well, there must be a significance to why the raven and why the dove, and it's actually that they serve very different roles. So Noach had to really put thought into this. Okay, good. Good. So Donna says the difference in the two species, the intentions. What is the difference between what the raven would learn and the dove would learn? Perfect, Norman. Sheila says, what I find interesting about the overall deconstructing of this text is that we live in a world that separates Bible from science, and yet we are searching for answers by using what we understand about the animal kingdom, science. Very good. And Sheila, that's actually something that Radak is known for, is bringing the science into his work. And so different commentators are known for different things. Like different commentators, some are going to stick just on the pshat, just on the literal meaning. Some, like Ibn Ezra, are more focused on grammar. Some are more focused on drawing, like the Radak is one of them actually, is more focused on that he says that we shouldn't just read the text for as it is for historical understanding, but actually it should give us meaning into our own social and political lives. And so the different commentators sort of have different agendas and styles. And so ultimately the goal is to get to know the commentators enough to get a sense of their styles and what they're trying to answer. Okay, one more piece from the Radak. So the Radak says, on the line, the dove could not find a resting place for its foot and returned him to the ark. To him, the line specifically says, returned to him to the ark. So he says to him so that he would understand that it had not found anything. That it's like the dove specifically goes back to Noach to communicate to Noach that it didn't find anything. To the ark, why does it also say the ark? So that it could come to rest on the outside of the ark. So what is the Radak noticing? He's noticing a redundancy in the verse, that it could just said, the dove could not find a resting place for its foot and it returned to him. Or it could have just said, the dove could not find a resting place for its foot and it returned to the ark. But what does it say? To him, to the ark. So he says, there must be meaning in that. To him means it went to Noach because it was finishing its mission to Noach and communicating to Noach, I didn't find anything. And to the ark, he goes on to say, having failed to bring anything back, it did not want to re-enter the ark. It's as if the Radak is putting onto the dove that it's as if the dove felt bad about not finding anything. He then adds on the line, so putting out his hand, he took it into the ark with him. He adds, when Noach saw that it was reluctant to enter the ark, he put his hand out through the opening and brought it back inside. Okay, so what are you getting from the Radak's commentary? What is he noticing? What is he interested in? What is he adding here? So Donna says forgiveness for the dove. I mean, it's really, I think, beautiful and surprising in the Radak's commentary that it's adding in a relationship between the dove and Noach. That it's not just that Noach sends out this bird, but that, the dove is returning directly to Noach, but the dove is then reluctant and feels bad. That the dove, think about it, that it's normally we just think the birds go forth, but actually the dove has feelings about the fact of having failed at its mission and is reluctant to re-enter. Man and animal relationships, great, Maria. Audrey says compassion for the dove. That Joanne says the dove is aware of its job and feeling guilty when it couldn't accomplish it. You really begin to think of whoever thought about the dove and what it feels like to be the dove going forth to check out the world after the flood, of what it feels like to being the first or the second person, second animal to sort of re-emerge. And suddenly the Radak is giving a sense of the weight of the dove's mission of re-entering the world and the responsibility of reporting back to Noach. Chris said the dove's natural world is to fly in the sky, so it is reluctant to go back into the ark. The world is not as it should be yet. Yeah. Oh, good. So Rhea's pointing us to a book. The Pigeon and the Boy shows the relationship between those birds and the handler. I mean, it's just sort of amazing that this commentary is adding in a whole sort of psychology to the dove, what it's like to re-enter the world, the relationship between Noach that we wouldn't have otherwise have seen. Okay, so I think we have time to look at one more commentary. So the Bechor Shor is writing in the 12th century France. In general, the Bechor Shor, Joseph ben Isaac, is written mostly in the pshat, in the sort of literal understanding of the verse. So he's also going to comment on the phrase, it went to and fro. Again, just noticing all these commentators think there's something weird about that raven, that he flies to and fro. What is that about? What does it mean? So that they need to notice it and comment on it. So he says, what does it mean it went to and fro? It was afraid to fly too far, lest it get fatigued and fall into the water. But it flew out to feed on the floating cadavers. So he's adding in a psychology of why does it go to and fro? It's sort of, he imagines that it's just sort of circling the ark. It's afraid to go out too far because it's afraid it's going to get tired and it's going to fall into the water that still surrounds it. So it's just flying to and fro because it's afraid to go too far away. He comments, the dove could not find a resting place for its foot. What does that mean? For the dove, unlike the raven, was not afraid to fly far away, since as a midrash tells us, it flies with only one wing at a time. When one gets tired, it switches to the other side. So again, I'll have you ask yourself, what question is the Bechor Shor answering? What is he giving us here? What is he trying to speak to? What is he interested in? Last line that we're going to do. So it says Noach put out his hand and brought the dove back into the ark, which really is an interesting line. It could have just been that the dove flies back to the ark, but actually we have this thing of Noach sort of receives the dove, and he says, what is it about Noach putting out his hand? So remember that in the Radak said, when Noach saw the dove was reluctant to enter the ark, he put his hand through the opening to bring it back in. So here, the Bechor Shor says, to check whether there was any dirt or mud on its legs or wings. So what does that mean? What is the Bechor Shor adding here? And how is it different than some of the other commentaries? How is the Bechor Shor's understanding of putting out his hand different than Radak's understanding of it? Great, so Joanne says, practical meaning as compared to compassion and motivation, that the Radak is really interested in the compassion and the motivation. And the Bechor Shor is saying, why does he have to check to see if there's dirt or mud on its legs? Presumably, I think to see if the water had gone down enough such that he could have gotten dirty, that I think if he finds the dirt or mud on its legs, it's an indicator that the water level has decreased enough that he was actually in the dirt in the land. So he's checking for something really practical, right? Deborah is saying something more scientific. Muriel says more real than giving dove human feelings. So they're noticing the same thing about the text, that there's something interesting about Noach putting out his hand. They're noticing that there's something unusual, but actually the two commentators can come up with two very different reasonings. Howard says, in Bechor Shor's thinking, Noach's relation to the birds is an I-it relationship. Okay, so you're saying, like, what is the bird going to teach me? I need to use the bird to learn something about the state of the world. In Radak's, it's an I-thou relationship. So Howard is referencing Buber, the famous thinker, I-thou, which is a me and you relationship, that Noach actually has a direct relationship, not just what can I get from you, what are you going to give me? Okay, so I'm going to stop screen sharing now for a moment. Let's just take a minute to look back to where we've come. So we started, we're looking at the Chumash today. We're looking at the Chumash coming from the word Chamesh, the 5 books. We were diving into the story of Noach. And our goal of the story was to put on our commentators' lens, to be like commentators and to notice what was different, to notice what was interesting, and just to begin asking questions. And really the commentator that symbolizes that best for us is the Barbado. The Barbado, writing in the 15th century, who his commentary just starts out with 40 questions. He teaches us as a commentator how to ask questions. We then looked at a number of different commentaries. We looked at Rashi, we looked at the Bechor Shor, we looked at the Radak, and I brought you lines of their commentary in which they were all focusing on the same things. They were all focusing on that language of the raven is interesting to and from, or it's interesting, why send out the raven and the dove? What are their different functions? Or why does Noach specifically put out his hand to bring it back? So they're all noticing the same strange and interesting things in the text, but they actually offer us really different understandings of it. So I want to pause here for a moment, and I'll just have you put into the chat I'd love to hear if there's something that you learned about the text today, either through your own close reading or through reading the commentaries, that makes you see this text differently. What did you learn about the text? What did you discover about this text today through this close reading and through the commentaries? What did you discover? In what way are you seeing this text anew? And just put that right in there.
While people are doing that, can I ask you 3 quick questions?
Please.
First is there like a list? Has someone put together a list of the commentators, you know, their names, when they lived, and then their style? So like if people are in the audience and they are working on their own Devar Torahs or studying the text and they want to like explore different commentators, can we find that list to share? The second is related. If many people on like Howard give Devar Torahs. So for you, when you do a Devar Torah, who's your go-to commentator? Like who's your favorite? And the third is, why are so many of these commentators you share with us from France?
That's
Those
a great
are my 3
question.
questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so starting with from France, I think in some, I mean, there's definitely other commentators that I could have brought, some from, you know, we could have looked at the Rashbam, who's from Spain. We could have looked at Sforno, who's from Italy. So I think in some ways it was a random sampling, because I was bringing commentators that were all talking about the same things, but with different answers. Certainly there was a center of learning in France, that in some ways Rashi, you know, in the 11th century started this school of thought that was a part of, but we could have also found from other places. In terms of that list, Ari, that would be such a great resource. I was looking around for it for myself to bring for this class, and I didn't find it exactly as you were talking about, but I'm still convinced that it must be out there. So I'll do a little bit more work to see if I can find something like that out there, because that would be such an incredible resource what you're asking for. In terms of my go-to, it's such a good question. This goes back to my opening, that I think that the incredible gift of being Jewish is that there's always so much more to learn, and you could always be sort of revisiting the same text with different commentators. So I think that the answer to that, it changes on the year, because each year I'm trying to learn and expose myself to different commentators. So it's not always the same person. This year, I'm really getting into, I'm trying to really learn Chassidut, sort of texts that have a more spiritual, mystical focus. And so I'm turning to a lot, my go-tos right now are Hasidic thinkers. I've been reading a lot of the Eish Kodesh, who Rabbi Colonius Kalman Shapiro, the Eish Kodesh, who's writing during the time of the Holocaust. Whenever I'm looking for a Devar Torah, I first go to him. But that's just what I'm doing right now. Next year, it could be Rashi, it could be something else. And so I think that that's like a real inspiration. My advice there would be to pick someone for a year, or pick someone for 6 months, make that person yours. And then next year, you can choose another person to come back to. Okay, I see that in the meantime, you put in some thoughts. So let's just read these out and then we'll end there. So people are thinking about, Miriam is taking from this, all questions are valuable. It's an amazing thing, the best thing you can take. That's amazing. Ellen is saying the importance of the use of numbers within text. We have, rather than finding a relationship between text and its relationship to our behavior now, these commentators look with a closer examination and the text relationship to itself. Yeah, really staying within the text. Miriam is saying all interpretations are valuable. To learn to read the words between the words. Sharon, I love that. That's so beautiful. Okay, I know that we covered a lot today, and it was a bit of a whirlwind. Ari, I'll look for that resource that you're asking about to see if it exists, or see if I can put something together like that myself. We're going to be continuing with this story next week. We're sticking with Noah. We're going to be going in deeper to the dove and the raven, into the world of Midrash, the world of interpretation. And we're going to be looking at both some ancient Midrashim and a really, really beautiful modern Midrash on the role of the dove and the raven and going out into this world for the first time. So I look forward to learning with you next week.
Thank you, everybody. So hope you enjoyed part 1 of Revisiting the Jewish Bookshelf. Hope it puts you in the mode in Elul to revisit your own bookshelf or add books to your bookshelf. I put in the text, and I'll email you after this, the name of the English translation by Karasak of the commentators. I think Amy has the whole collection. It is awesome to have that. And many of you participate in your synagogue study sessions. Some of you have never done this before. It's great to have the variety with us. And we'll see you next week. So good to see everybody. See you tomorrow. for different programs. Oh, Browers. I see Martin and Tamar Brower. Of course, we're honoring them for the whole month of January. So I haven't really brought it up much because it's going to be a whole month of just Brower honoring. I've worked on some secret projects for them already. But and Myra Weiss, thank you so much for your becoming a patron of CSP yesterday, the last day of our summer fundraising drive. You very, very, very appreciative. Thank you so much. Everybody else, thank you for donating to CSP and being with us and learning. And I have someone named Celio who's in a car learning. So that's awesome. You guys can learn anywhere as long as you learn. Have a great day. We'll see you tomorrow. Take care. David Silverman, good to see you. Hunter Kaplan's forehead, nice to see you too. Rita Rubin, good to see you. Okay. Ada Gilbert, everybody. Take care, Barry Klasker. See you tomorrow.